We can make our own reality. We can talk about history, but not too long. We need to talk about our now. Black people have a tendency to focus and march when a white person kills a black person or wears a hat. But when it's 700 kids being killed in Chicago, it's okay. It's okay for blacks to kill blacks.
It is not a race problem in America. It's not what government does for you or what white people do. In fact, I think those who continue to push this race agenda are Eurocentric. They assume that the destiny of blacks is determined by what white people do. That has never been the case. If we were able to close the education gap between 1920 and 1940 through self-determination and hard work, if we were able to out-test white schools in those cities, then the question is, in those same schools today in Baltimore, for instance, where they're run by blacks, not a single student could read at grade level or perform at grade level. And so how can you say that it is racism that is the cause of the present day challenges?
This is a very interesting conversation between Patrick David and Robert Woodson, talking about the real problem black people are facing right now in America. Robert Woodson is saying that all evidence and statistics show that race is not a problem. I find this interesting because many people still believe race has to do with probably 90% of our problems. Kanye West was right all along when he said we point fingers at other people when we should be blaming ourselves. He even said he had abandoned this culture of victimization, and a lot of people went after him, calling him names but, in the end, proving him right.
Let's say you turned your back on the culture or
exactly 100%. I have turned my back on the idea of victimization mentality. We are locked up. We went from 1 and 4. We went from 1 and 4 to 1 and 3, but we always pointing at the white people, but yet we want to spend all of our money on foreigners.
Robert Woodson said that at one point, when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best because we never depended on the government to help us. When we were refused access to hotels, we built our own, financed by our own means. When we were denied access to colleges, we built our own. Bob is saying our small business formation rate was higher than whites in the 20s. It's not about what the government does for you, but what you do for yourself.
When whites were at their worst, we were at our best. As I said, in 1930 to 1940, when segregation and racism was enshrined in law, blacks had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. Elderly people could walk safely in those communities without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. So let's look at the evidence. When we refused access to hotels, we built our own hotels, financed by our own means. When we were denied access to colleges, we built our own. And in fact, our small business formation rate was higher than whites in the 20s, and that really determines any group's participation in the economy. It is not what government does for you or what white people do.
So how has everything changed so much now? Before we go crazy on Robert Woodson, let's look at the history and confirm if what he's saying is true or not, targeting especially the 1920s. During the 1920s, African Americans experienced significant advancements in marriage and economic status despite facing widespread racial discrimination and segregation. This period, known as the Roaring Twenties, witnessed a surge of cultural, social, and economic changes that impacted various communities, including African Americans. While the progress made during this time was not uniform across all regions or individuals, there is evidence to suggest that Black Americans achieved notable improvements in marriage rates and economic opportunities. Let's look at the marriage rates. Statistical data from the 1920s indicates a rise in marriage rates among African Americans. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the number of black marriages increased steadily during this decade. The 1920 census reported that approximately 40% of black men and women aged 15 years and older were married, compared to around 35% in 1910. By 1930, this figure had risen to nearly 45%. These figures demonstrate a positive trend in marriage rates among African Americans during the 1920s. Alongside an increase in marriage rates, there was also a decline in divorce rates among African Americans during the 1920s. The U.S. Census Bureau data reveals that divorce rates among black couples decreased significantly during this period. In 1920, the divorce rate for black couples stood at around 6%, but by 1930, it had dropped to approximately 4%. This decline suggests greater stability within black marriages during the Roaring '20s. Another factor contributing to improved marriage rates among African Americans during this period was increased educational attainment. As more black individuals gained access to education, they were more likely to marry and form stable households. The National Urban League's The State of Black America report highlights that the number of black college graduates increased significantly during the 1920s. This rise in educational attainment positively influenced marriage rates within the black community.
We closed the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940. How do we do it? Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears, came together with Booker T. Washington, and he put up $4 million. The black community matched it with $4.8 million. We built 5,000 schools to teach ex-slaves how to read and write. And as a consequence of that study, that in between 1920 and 1940, the education gap in the South between whites and blacks was 3 years. 8th grade for whites, 5th grade for blacks. Within 20 years, that gap closed within 6 months. There were 5 high schools at the turn of the century in New York, Baltimore, Washington, Atlanta, and New Orleans. They had used textbooks, overcrowded classrooms, half the budgets of white schools, but every one of those schools out-tested every white school in those cities.
Now let's look at economic advancements. The 1920s witnessed a significant migration of African Americans from rural areas to urban centers, particularly in the North. This movement, known as the Great Migration, provided black individuals with increased access to employment opportunities in expanding industries such as manufacturing, construction, and transportation. The migration resulted in improved economic prospects for many African Americans, leading to higher wages and better living conditions. African Americans also made strides in entrepreneurship and business ownership during the 1920s. The period saw the emergence of successful black-owned businesses, particularly in urban areas. Notable examples include the establishment of the National Negro Business League by Booker T. Washington and the growth of the Harlem Renaissance, which fostered a vibrant cultural and economic scene for black entrepreneurs. These developments contributed to overall economic advancement within the black community. The 1920s marked a significant increase in the number of black professionals across various fields. African Americans began to break barriers in professions such as law, medicine, education, and journalism. For instance, Dr. Charles Drew became a renowned surgeon and researcher, while lawyer Charles Hamilton Houston played a pivotal role in dismantling racial segregation through his work with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. These achievements not only improved economic prospects for black professionals but also inspired future generations. Despite the lingering effects of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and systemic racism, improved access to education and employment helped drive economic gains. One thing that made us unstoppable was the fact that we never cared about what other people were doing to us, not even the government. We did all we could to improve ourselves and achieve greatness. As much as racism is still there, that shouldn't be an excuse or the reason why we are not progressing as a community. We need to fight against all odds to make it. So, to be honest, Robert Woodson is right. It's not a race problem but mindset.